much more, as so many allies have already begun to do. We will produce more and more quickly. All over the alliance, we will work to cut.
Stabbed approximately 100 times by multiple gang members before he was shot in the head.
Bondi says the suspects stabbed the victim so many times because the act was part of achieving a higher level in their gang. The Department of Justice will review the suspects to see if it will seek the death penalty. The incident took place in 2015. Bondi says Friday's arrest serves as a warning to criminals across the country.
We don't care how long ago you committed the crime. We don't care where you go. We will find you.
Bondi added a warning to gang members currently living in the U.S., saying criminals will be found eventually and that it's better to self-deport from the country. This comes as deportation flights to Venezuela continue. On Friday morning, a U.S. flight carrying 208 deported Venezuelans landed. On Thursday, 2 flights touched down in Venezuela, one with over 300 deportees and one with almost 200. A Venezuelan official confirms that at least some of the deportees have criminal records in Venezuela.
According to the study by our immigration authorities, we have detected that some people on this flight have criminal records.
Among the individuals recently sent back to Venezuela is a social media content creator who was deported for inciting hatred and profiting from child labor. He's accused of calling for people to invade unoccupied homes and take advantage of U.S. government funding programs.
Many people who came on his flight were disgusted because his campaign portrayed Venezuelans as criminals to the rest of the world.
The individual is called Leonel Moreno. ICE detained him in 2024. He'll now face charges in Venezuela. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
And South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol was order as a step to downsize the Department of Education, but abolishing the entire agency would require an act of Congress. And China is now responding to new U.S. tariffs by putting a 34% across-the-board tariffs on all U.S. goods. And President Trump criticizing the move while also saying that the TikTok deal is making progress. He's extending the deadline for it to be sold for another 75 days. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
Beijing has announced a 34% tariff on all U.S. products starting April 10th. This is in response to the sweeping tariffs on China announced by the United States on Wednesday. President Trump added a 34% tariff on China on top of the 20% imposed earlier this year, making for a total of 54%. Before the 34% across-the-board tariffs, China had a variety of different tariff amounts on the U.S. depending on the type of product or industry. Trump responded to the Chinese regime's announcement on Truth Social, saying, quote, "China played it wrong. They panicked. The one thing they cannot afford to do." Trump has also announced that the date of the TikTok ban will be extended. He said on social media that he'll be signing an executive order to extend the deadline another 75 days. TikTok originally had until Saturday to sell to a non-China-owned company or face a ban in the United States. On Thursday, Trump said U.S. tariffs could play a role in the TikTok situation.
China will probably say, we'll approve a deal, but will you do something on the tariff? The tariffs give us great power to negotiate.
In response to the Trump administration's Chinese import tariffs, nonprofit civil rights group New Civil Liberties Alliance filed a federal lawsuit in Florida. The group alleges that the president overstepped his authority with the sweeping tariffs, in addition to levies he introduced in February by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And staying on the topic of tariffs, 4 Republican senators joined Senate Democrats to pass a resolution that would block the Trump administration's across-the-board tariffs on Canada. The chamber voted 51 to 48 on Wednesday. Republican Senators Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, and Lisa Murkowski voted to pass the resolution. The resolution does not have the force of law and is not expected to come up for a vote in the House. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
The Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the U.S. is working to reset global trade with President Trump's new reciprocal tariffs. That's the message Rubio is sending to NATO allies in Brussels today. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
If you're a company and you make a bunch of your products in China, and all of a sudden shareholders or people that play the stock market realize that it's going to cost a lot more to produce in China, your stock is going to go down.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio said today to NATO allies in Brussels that the U.S. must reset the global trade order.
We have to be a country that thinks we're the largest consumer market in the world, and yet the only thing we export is services. And we need to stop that. We need to get back to a time where we're a country that can make things, and to do that, we have to reset the global order of trade.
Rubio's comments on trade comes just 2 days after President Trump announced new tariffs on many countries. This includes a 20% tax on imports from the European Union. Rubio saying markets will adjust.
They just need to know what the rules are. Once they know what the rules are, they will adjust to those rules.
NATO
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So, first of all, talk to us about the NATO meeting today. What are some of the biggest takeaways in your opinion?
I think the biggest thing is an influence and basically enhancing that NATO and the NATO countries, especially in the European Union, are going to increase their particular contribution. It's usually been around at 3%, and there's a push to get to 5%. I think Poland's probably the closest. But I think this was a great thing to see Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and Japan attending, which is great because we see an influence and an increase of activities with the Chinese military around Taiwan. That's what stand out for me today.
And speaking of which, Secretary Marco Rubio at a NATO meeting today commented on the impact of U.S. tariffs.
No, their economies are not crashing. Their markets are reacting to a dramatic change in the global order in terms of trade. And so what happens is pretty straightforward. If you're a company and you make a bunch of your products in China, and all of a sudden shareholders or people that play the stock market realize that it's going to cost a lot more to produce in China, your stock is going to go down. But ultimately, the markets, as long as they know what the rules are going to be moving forward, and as long as that's set and you can sustain where you're going to be, the markets will adjust.
From a defense perspective, what are some of the impacts of tariffs potentially?
Well, I think this transition is definitely going to be tough, and I think that's an economic thing. But from a military perspective, if we look at what has happened, a lot of the manufacturing, both of integrated circuits and even our medications, our antibiotics mainly, are manufactured in China. So if there was a particular conflict, it would be very difficult to take care of our people, of course, where all these things are being done offshore. With the tariffs alignment, we're going to see that manufacturing and productions, most of it, at least this is the target of it, is going to come back to the United States. That's the intent. The interesting part is we see Japan, Korea, and China economically starting to increase, or at least discuss just a few days ago, about increasing trade. So we see some alignment of there in Asia Pacific, which again is economical. But these countries, are allies to the United States. But again, I think that it brings more production back to the United States so that things like medications and so forth that are important, especially in wartime, will be manufactured back in the United States. But like I said, this is very tumultuous because it is a transition and a calibration again.
To your point, President Trump did mention that exact point during his announcement this week, saying that it's a national security issue to bring some of these critical industries back home.
Got that right.
I want to play you another clip. This is from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at
crime, sexual assault, and unsafe water activity involving jet ski or boat operators. The State Department also urges travelers to be aware of the strict firearm laws in the Bahamas.
When we citizenship requirements for voter registration, it also prevents states from counting mail-in ballots they receive after Election Day. The order directs the withholding of election funds from states that don't enforce the requirements. The attorneys general argue the executive order amounts to an unprecedented seizure of power over election administration. The lawsuit also accuses Trump of impeding states' control over how elections are run. Democratic congressional leaders and nonpartisan organizations filed similar lawsuits challenging the executive order earlier this week. While Democrats have said it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, Republicans have raised concerns about how the lack of verification may allow some non-citizens to lie in order to register. A powerful storm system will bring
crime and immigration. The decision follows a federal bribery case against Adams, which was dismissed last week. With low approval ratings and no access to public campaign funds, he faces an uphill battle. His independent run sets up a major showdown in November against the Democratic nominee, possibly former Governor Andrew Cuomo, and a Republican challenger.
Next generation, so that as they grow older,
that they would make, improved health decisions, as they become adults. And that's ultimately, I think, how we improve healthcare outcomes. It's about prevention and education for our current school students.
Important topic for sure. Evan Worrell,
Yeah.
thank you so much for
And
joining
educate
us.
them properly.
Tiffany, thank you.
Coming up in the NHL, and
It's going to really benefit from this.
Back in the 1920s, we didn't have taxation on our people. Now that tariffs are put back in place, I do believe my children will be able to live
1913.
part of their life no taxes.
So President Trump said the main objective of this round of tariffs is to onshore investments and bring manufacturing back home to the United States. And the caveat is there's going to be short-term pain. I guess the question here would be, are you willing to buy the bullet, at least for now?
Absolutely. It would be nice to bring some manufacturing back because we've lost so much over the past decades.
We've been biting the bullet for the last 4 years, so we can bite it a little bit longer.
It doesn't happen overnight. As most people would tell you, to build the infrastructure, it takes a decade, half a decade even to get started or something like that. Never mind the labor costs in the U.S. will never really allow manufacturing to compete on a global level.
Oh, for short term, absolutely. And I have no problem in general with reciprocal tariffs. Yeah, I think if we knew exactly when things will even out, I'd be more comfortable with it. But for right now, we don't know what short term really means.
Anything worth anything, marriage, love, cement flooring, monuments, anything, you got to put the pain and the effort in. But you get the long-term benefit, and it's permanent.
Well, I certainly am, but we seem to be a pretty impatient people. All good things take a little time, and all growth has a little pain.
K through 12 schools that want federal money have federal civil rights laws. Specifically, they'll have to certify that they've eliminated diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights Craig Traynor explained, saying, quote, federal financial assistance is a privilege, not a right. Traynor added that a number of schools were using DEI programs to discriminate against certain groups. The certification asks state and school leaders to acknowledge that their federal money is conditioned on compliance with civil rights laws. Schools and states that engage in illegal DEI practices could lose grants and contracts. K through 12 institutions could also be held liable under the False Claims Act for defrauding government programs. A federal judge continues to express skepticism over whether the Trump administration defied his order to recall planes deporting more than 200 alleged immigrant gang members to El Salvador. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards has details from an afternoon hearing where the judge suggested the Trump administration had acted irresponsibly.
At a hearing on Thursday, federal judge James Boasberg said the Justice Department acted in bad faith on March 15th by attempting to deport illegal immigrants to El Salvador. The DOJ claimed that the administration complied with the judge's order. But Boasberg said, quote, it seems to me there is a fair likelihood that that is not correct. This isn't the first time that Boasberg has required the department to respond to his questions about whether it defied his order. On March 15th, Boasberg issued an emergency restraining order to block the Trump administration from deporting suspected Venezuelan gang members to an El Salvador prison under the Alien Enemies Act. In the days that followed, Boasberg requested flight information for each plane, including takeoff and landing time, as well as information on when Trump published his proclamation that invoked the act. The department contends that at the time of the written order, 3 airplanes carrying the immigrants had already left U.S. airspace. Boasberg had first given a verbal order to turn the planes around. The department's attorney declined to answer on Thursday when the judge asked him if he communicated the verbal directive to Trump officials, citing the attorney-client privilege. Boasberg said, in fact, the government acted in bad faith throughout that day. You really believed everything you did that day was legal and could survive a court challenge. I can't believe you ever would have operated in the way you did. In prior weeks, the DOJ refused to reveal any further information about those flights by invoking the state secrets privilege, which protects national security concerns. The case, filed by 5 Venezuelan immigrants held at a Texas facility, seems to present the most consequential face-off between executive and judicial branches as the administration faces a flood of lawsuits. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has submitted a filing to the Supreme Court asking it to get rid of the restraining order. They're also asking the highest court to block the district court from issuing any further restraining orders. Trump believes he has the proper executive power to deport suspected dangerous criminals with close ties to the Venezuelan government. Meanwhile, Boasberg is considering what consequences the Trump administration should face if he decides that it willfully violated his March 15th
He doesn't
order.
have it right.
Arlene Richards, NTD News.
The Defense Department announced it will review Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's use of Signal while discussing last month's military strikes in Yemen. Acting Inspector General Stephen Stebbins wrote a letter to Hegseth saying the goal of this investigation will be to determine if Hegseth and others complied with protocol while using the commercial messaging app. This
become a political court. So in recent years, it has become not a neutral legal court, but a political court. And this was most clearly shown by the decisions regarding Israel.
And Netanyahu thanked Orban for leaving the ICC, making Hungary the first country in the European Union to do so.
You've just taken a bold and principled position on the ICC, and I thank you, Victor. This is not only important for us, it's important for all democracies. The ICC directs its actions against us, fighting a just war with just means, and of course not against our tormentors.
In a statement, the ICC presidency expressed concern about Hungary's decision and urged it to stay committed to the ICC's founding agreement. Meanwhile, in the war in the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces have now taken over Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip. On Thursday, hundreds of thousands of residents fled from the city, many of whom ended up in nearby Khan Yunis.
I am telling you, I was packing my belongings with the plane hovering over our heads. Until when will this continue? Until when?
But even Khan Yunis isn't free from Israeli airstrikes. Residents were seen inspecting the aftermath of an Israeli airstrike that hit an area filled with tents.
Why is Netanyahu expanding the operation? What is the operation he is expanding?
And it appears that residents in the Gaza Strip continue to ask how long the war will continue and why it's happening without mentioning the hostages that are still being held in the Gaza Strip. And that is what Israeli officials continue to repeat as the reason for the operations. Might the residents be afraid to mention the hostages because of possible retaliation from Hamas? According to a post on X from the official account from the State of Israel, a 22-year-old Palestinian man who recently participated in the protest in Gaza was tortured and killed, and his body was left at his family's doorstep. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Widespread.
Why do people think they have to leave those things right in the middle of everything? And we got all this space on this sidewalk to put it. Over there. You got to leave it right in the middle. Flatliner.